life in China about 4,000 years ago. And the juice was extracted from rhubarb and shipped all over the world. Sailing vessels would sail into the ports in China and pick up this wonderful medicine that was really believed to cure almost any ill. Well, rhubarb, of course, moved across Asia, into Europe, finally into Great Britain. There was a time in Scotland when there were 50-acre farms growing nothing but rhubarb, which was being shipped off to factories to be made into medicine. Well, rhubarb came, of course, with the settlers, as so many other things did, to Upper Canada. And it was some desperate housewife that we believe here in Upper Canada decided for the first time that she needed something to fill a pie shell, and she didn't have anything. All her fruit was gone, there was nothing in the garden, and she decided that she would pull some of that tart medicine and she would use it with some honey or some maple syrup, maple sugar, molasses, something to sweeten it, and rhubarb pie was born. For about 50 years here in Upper Canada, about the time of the War of 1812, right through the Rebellion of 1837, if you have a handwritten cookbook from your family, and they're talking about pie plant pie, they are actually talking about rhubarb, because so much of it was used for pies that it just became known as pie plant. No one was calling it rhubarb. Sure.
Leaves, what would they do with all those gorgeous green leaves?
They were used to clean their pewter. And a great many people in 1812, particularly a lot of the officers in the mess, it would be pewter that they would still be using on their tables at that point. And it was a great cleaner, a cleanser for pewter. Just rub it. Dandelions is another thing that we abhor today. We can't wait to get rid of them in our lawns and gardens. Our ancestors would have felt very fortunate to have dandelions on their land, because the roots could be cooked and mashed as a spring tonic, or they could be cleansed, roasted, and ground to make coffee. The young leaves could be used in a salad, or of course, they could be cooked as a vegetable. You were talking about lamb's quarters a minute ago, being boiled. And of course, the gentlemen who are in our audience tonight would have been out on a sunny day like today, picking those yellow flowers and getting ready to make a crock of dandelion wine. Now then, how about medicines? For just a moment, let me talk about a few things, and Dennis has already also mentioned a few. A bee sting. You pulled out the stinger and you would apply a little honey to it. And everyone would indeed be trying to keep bees because they wanted that honey. But they also believed that bees were messengers of heaven. And therefore, if someone in your family passed away, I was sorry to hear about June's brother, but you would have gone out to your beehive in the back of your house or out in your orchard, and you would have put a black veil over the beehive to let them know there had been a death in the family, and then you'd circle the beehive and talk about the person. You'd mention their name, and the feeling and sense that our ancestors had was that those bees would carry that word to God. Be ready. George is coming, or Mary is going to arrive. If God was all powerful, one assumes that knowledge would already be up there. But anyway, mosquitoes. Dennis again mentioned mosquitoes. Rub a little vinegar on it. Wasps. Cut your onion again. This is an important vegetable. Cut your onion and rub it over the sting. Some of the herbs like chervil were great for curing hiccups, and it was believed that if you ate enough parsley, that would prevent baldness. So you have your garden, you've harvested it, and now you're concerned about keeping it so that you will have something to eat through the rest of the summer, through the autumn, and all of next winter. Well, you're going to have to preserve some of it, and you need a cool, dry place. Vegetables, as well as just being laid out, as Dennis seems to have great success in doing, could be stored in sand, in sawdust, or in barrels of bran. Fruit, if you had paper, could be wrapped in paper. Some vegetables could be pickled in vinegar, of course, made into pickles. And if you had fruit that you were trying to preserve, you could preserve it with sugar, with honey, with molasses, with maple syrup, or, of course, with spirits. Some of your herbs, such as some that Dennis has brought tonight, could just be hung up near your fireplace to dry, and then hopefully perhaps crush it and put it in a clean cotton bag, hang it up high away from those rodents and those mice and so on that you talked about earlier. Things like apples and pumpkins could be cut into slices and hung on strings to dry as well. I think that at this moment, as we're talking about drying things, let's see how something would taste, if you're brave enough to try it, that has been dried. I think, yes. On these plates I'm going to pass around, and there's two of them, one's going to go down this side, one's going to go down that side. On one side, it's unfortunate, these are both called red. This is dried beef. It would have been called jerky. Down here, we have dried cranberries. Now today, I did wash them in hot water before I brought them. So they have been partially reconstituted. That's how you would reconstitute something so that you could use it. For example, those apple slices I mentioned a moment ago, or pumpkin slices, if you wanted to put those in a pie, you would soak those in water for probably an hour or two, or maybe overnight. And then you would just use it as a normal slice of apple from fresh apple. So, Dennis, are you helping? Thank you. This could go down this side, and you may need finger wipers, I'm not sure. And don't worry, if you don't want to try these things, my feeling is you're not going to. Here we are, June, I'll let you, and I think you can just pass it along hand to hand.
Not too many, because
We're not counting, we're not counting.
Pass the napkins ahead.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea.
One of the favorite foods of the fur traders, and I should say that there were indeed a great many fur traders passing through Upper Canada, doing business here during the war, prior to the War of 1812, during the War of 1812, and doing million-dollar business in this part of North America. And one of their favorite foods, in addition to jerky, which you're trying, was pemmican. Now, pemmican was usually ground meat from moose or deer, with grease added, and some dried berries, such as the cranberries you're eating, or dried blueberries, or something like that, and then packed in leather bags. And they would be buried in the ground at places where the fur traders knew they were going to be traveling. They had very inclined routes to their interior posts. They knew they'd be passing this way in 3 months again, and they put these bags of, leather bags of pemmican in the ground and come back and dig them out and use them. It's interesting that just a few months ago, I read in one of the Toronto papers that a Manitoba farmer had just plowed up a bag of pemmican. So think of the age of that. Did not tell us in the article, unfortunately, whether he was brave enough to try it. I doubt it somehow. Now then, let's talk a little bit about taking some of these ingredients that we've all been talking about and turning them into food. Well, the first thing, of course, was bread. Bread was a staple diet not only of the First Nations, who had been using cornmeal, but of the settlers who, of course, tried to grow wheat.
And try
Wheat
some of the
was
cranberry?
indeed the grain of choice, unless perhaps you were Scottish and then it might be oats. But how to get that bread to rise? And today, of course, we just go off to the local store, buy some yeast, come home, and away we go. We can even have quick rising yeast that has that bread rising in no time. Not so easy in these early years, 1812. You had to make your own yeast. You made it either out of potatoes or hops, a vine that you'd be growing in your herb garden. And if you had extra, you'd be selling to the local distillery or the local brewery or the local storekeeper. But you were growing it yourself because you wanted to make your yeast out of it. Or sometimes you would put those two things together, potatoes and hops, to make yeast. If there was a brewery nearby, if you lived in York, and you could go to a brewery and buy some of his brewer's yeast, you'd take a container and bring it home and put a cupful or 2 cupfuls, whatever you needed, for the size of bread that you were going to need, and turn into loaves. Or, if your husband was making his own beer, and from the diaries I've read, every man in Upper Canada was trying to make his own beer in these early years from something, vegetables, plants, weeds, things they found in the forest, and so on. And part of the reason, not only did they need the stimulant of a beer or liquor, but also they brought with them a fear of the water, because in their homelands, in many of their homelands, it was not safe to drink the water. So they didn't think of taking the water out of a stream or from a well and actually using it as a beverage just the way it was. They wanted beer, or of course they wanted spirits if they were available, and the women, of course, they tell us, were drinking tea. They were not enjoying the beer or the spirits. Right. So, if you were doing finer baking, how could you make that thing, that cake, those cookies, whatever you had, rise? Well, you could beat it. And some of the early handwritten cookbooks, we have an 1811 cookbook of Hannah Jarvis's. It says beat for 1 hour.
Oh.
Trying to get air into that recipe. Beat egg whites and add those to your recipe. Or you could use something called pearl ash. And you're saying, what is it? Well, you talk to potash, that ash that results when you pull those trees into a pile and burn the ash. The potash was used for barter, for trade, for real money, shipped to England for the soap industry and so on. It was a native woman, we believe, who first realized that if you took some of that potash, heated it even more, got a finer white powder, then dropped it into your baking, it had a magical effect.
Oh.
And this idea never spread across the ocean. It was something that was known seemingly just in the northern United States and here in upper and lower Canada. So pearl ash could be purchased, can't be purchased today. When I found my first recipe with it in, I went into a drugstore and said to the druggist, I want to buy some pearl ash. And he bristled and said, what do you want it for? And I thought, oops. And I tried to explain to him that I worked in a museum village, I wanted to do it for try it for some baking, and so on. And he said, it is not available. Not available. I said, let's talk about it. He said, no, we're not talking about it, because it's not available. So that was the end of that. But when I was doing this research and trying to find recipes, I found the first Canadian cookbook that was printed in Canada, and I think I've talked to some of you about this before, so excuse me while I discuss it again. It was 1831, it was after the War of 1812, but the recipes that were in this book were so simple, so bland, They were ingredients that every woman would have in her kitchen or her larder, that I'm sure they could have been made at the time of the war. It was a printer in Kingston, Ontario. His name was James McFarland. He heard that a cookbook was going to be printed, published across the border, across the river. So he went over and bought a copy, brought it back, took off the cover, put on his own cover. In 1831, he did nothing wrong. There were no copyright laws, so this was fine. And he advertised it as being the first Canadian book with recipes printed in Canada, which was absolutely correct. The amazing thing about this book is that it called for pearl ash in recipes, and there were a couple of cookie recipes in it. And that, in early days in Canada, was quite unique, because we had things called biscuits and wafers, but we didn't have the word cookie. It was a Dutch word that had come to the United States with Dutch settlers, then spread finally to Upper Canada. So the next thing I'm going to pass around for you to try is one of the recipes that was in it. Nice cookies that will keep good 3 months. And that tells us two extremely important things in these early years of the 1800s. By their standards, these taste good. They may not taste good by yours. I'm going to ask you that in a moment. And the other one was, they will keep good. And I just told you how difficult it was to keep anything. So here is a miracle. Here is a miracle recipe that will keep for 3 months. So let's have a try. There are only 5 ingredients in these cookies. And one of them, no, there would be 6 ingredients if I could have found pearl ash. There's only 5 ingredients in them. So there is no rising agent. There's nothing to make them rise. Well, I'm going to ask you in a minute what you think is in them, and then I'll tell you what really is. Okay? You probably will guess. I think they're fairly crisp. You should be careful of your precious teeth. You don't want any accidents.
They're good. What are the ingredients?
Well, just a minute, you're going to tell me what you think is in them.
Well, you took 2, well.
Okay, thanks.
What was wrong with what?
They're lovely. Lovely.
Oh, well, I think it's a chemical today that's probably been taken right off the market. It has, no, it's ashes. It's ashes refined, heated even more. So I have no idea. There's a research for you, a project. When I come back, if I'm ever invited back, you tell me why it's no longer available. We don't need it. By the 1850s, we had baking soda, baking powder, and cream of tartar. So we didn't need pearl ash anymore. But it's astonishing how many cookbooks in Canada that were still published in the 1890s are still calling for pearl ash. So evidently some cooks, some bakers thought it was okay. Okay, what do you think are in your nice cookies?
Whole wheat flour.
Whole wheat stone ground flour,
Egg.
butter, yes, everybody was trying to be self-sufficient, so you've been keeping a cow or 2 or 10 and churning a couple of times a week.
Egg.
No eggs,
How about molasses?
no milk.
Sugar of some kind.
Yes, and it calls for raw sugar, and I use modern raw sugar, which of course is nothing like the horrible raw sugar that would have been available in 1812. And I'll talk about sugar for just a second because I'm very conscious of the time.
Salt.
Okay, we've got 3 things: sugar, flour, and butter.
It's like caraway.
Good for you, caraway. Yes, and they believe caraway would settle your tummy. The fifth ingredient no one ever gets is just water. Yes.
Wouldn't they go moldy with water?
Well, mine didn't, because the first time I made these cookies, I took some of them, I put them in a crock, I tied a cloth around the top of it, I put a date on the crock, set it on my kitchen counter at room temperature. And 3 months later, I opened the crock and the cookies tasted exactly the way they tasted the day I made them. So I feel that, of course, they should be called magic cookies. I don't know why. I have no idea.
So were the caraway seeds ground up?
No.
Oh.
No. No, it's just the way you take a handful and toss them in. Okay?
Are there no other cookies that might last 3 months?
Not that I know of, but maybe there are. Well, the cookies people are making today will last forever, particularly the commercially made ones. They'll be around 1,000 years from now because they have so many preservatives in them. Yeah, June.
I wonder if it's because there's no egg in there that they last so long.
I have no idea.
Well, why does it sugar?
Maybe. Our ancestors brought with them that love of sugar. However, there wasn't a sugar refinery in all of British North America at the time of the War of 1812. So what was happening was, the sugar was being harvested in the islands to the south. It was being taken by sailing vessels to England, to the sugar refineries. It was being refined there, put on sailing vessels again, and brought back to the colonies in North America. And the form it was taking, you've all visited museums and you've seen those white cones sitting in their pantries or their kitchens. They look like a pyramid, they are about 1 foot high, they weigh between 11 and 14 pounds. When I was working on the restoration of Fort York, I thought, I wonder how expensive those were at the time of 1812. I wonder if the officers could afford one. And found out when I did the research that we translated it into today's money, it would be $100 for 11 pounds of white refined sugar. So no wonder they were using every substitute that they could find. Honey, maple syrup, maple sugar, whatever, raw sugar. You could buy a barrel of raw sugar, which was just what was gathered up in the fields after the harvesting was done, for about $6. But a woman would then have to decide how she could purify that, because it would just be the junk from the fields. It was nothing like the raw sugar that we can buy today. The final thing I'm going to pass around for you is what they might serve at the end of a meal. Once the meal was ready, were often eating enormous meals. And this enormous meal was the noon meal. They were eating dinner at noon in 1812. And they were always worrying about upset tummies. And they were always wanting to serve something right at the end that was going to settle this down. It was going to be like the caraway seeds that we had in the cookies. And so 2 of the most common things that they used were peppermints, or peppermint, the herb peppermint, and ginger. And of course there was wild ginger growing here, if they weren't able to afford to buy it from the general storekeeper when he brought it in to do the Christmas baking in the late fall. So what's going to come around now is something that was made by me, but something else that you're going to look at and say, ooh, these look very, very modern. And they are very, very modern. These are Scotch mints. Those fur traders I mentioned would have known them well. There was a woman in York in 1802, 10 years before the War of 1812, who had a sweet shop. And Mrs. Lumsden was selling English mints, Scottish mints, and gingerbread wafers.
Oh.
in the shape of circles, hearts, and dogs. If you see one of my dogs, you're going to really love it. Yes, I knew you'd laugh. And again, watch your teeth. These are crisp. Because again, this is an early 1800s.
So it's sort of like
Oh, not really. I was looking after my 14 children, feeding my oxen. Sure. How else would I get my plowing done?
Would they not just eat an apple for dessert?
No, I'm afraid they would not. That is very much a 20th century idea of taking a raw apple with you and eating it, you know, as the finish of your lunch. No, this was a world with a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of very heavy, sweet things like puddings, pies, and so on as desserts. I think that if you had offered guests an apple for dessert, you would have had to give them a silver knife with it so that they could peel it themselves and cut it into tiny, delicate little pieces. And that just didn't happen in this poor country of ours in 1812. It was still very much a frontier society.
it's so cute.
Well, there's more where it came from. I've got a freezer full of them now. I did a whole lot of them yesterday. So I've got a freezer full of dogs. I'm going to end now by just speaking for a moment about the book. The book is really the result of my own curiosity and my own disbelief that our history has been taught so badly in our schools. And I was, and still am, a teacher. I still do some teaching at Lakehead University in Oregon. When I became interested in the War of 1812, because it really isn't on the curriculum, or hasn't been until now, I would mention this event to an audience. One day it was a group of teachers. And they all started nodding and said, oh yes, we saw Gone with the Wind. And I thought, this is far more serious than I ever thought. I said, sorry, wrong war, wrong country, and about 50 years too late. And they were horrified. I said, really? Are you sure? Yes, I am sure. The astonishing thing to me as I did the research for this little booklet, and I want to really stress to the academics in this audience, this is not a scholarly work. I do not deal with the battles, usually. I do not deal with the uniforms or the buttons that were on them, or the kind of guns they were carrying, or the kind of swords they were carrying, or any of that. I do touch on one or two of the encounters, but only because I believe very strongly that at this time in our history in Canada, we had an incredible web of human relationships that had developed here. And that we often today in our modern society really don't recognize who was living in what we call Ontario in 1812. Well, there were those British military men at the forts. There were independent fur traders. There was both the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Fur Companies with their thousands of men working here. There were the newcomers looking for land. There were government officials, of course, the First Nations who'd been here from the beginning of time. There were some Americans and there were some British. And In many communities, there's very strong borders drawn between blood and status and race and nationality, but they were never seemingly sharply drawn here. Everyone realized that if they were going to survive and prosper, they had to be a team. And so I would like to read you just a tiny excerpt from one chapter, and it's only one of two chapters in the whole book where I deal with what happened in a battle. But I think that it's kind of interesting, and it brings home to us how they could cooperate when they really needed to. The first blow is half the battle. This happens to be chapter 13. We may never know what flashed through Captain Charles Roberts' mind when he received word from Major General Brock that war had been declared by the United States. It was July the 8th, 1812, and this was indeed confirmation that swift action was needed. How did Brock, and in turn Roberts, know so quickly? Now, those of you who know that war was declared on June the 18th are thinking, this man didn't learn about it until July the 8th, that's 3 weeks later. But at that period in time, this was quick. How did Brock, and in turn Roberts, know so quickly that President James Madison had signed a declaration of war against Great Britain on June 18th? The web of human relationships that had developed in Upper Canada and beyond was the key. For everyone involved in the fur trade was vitally interested in the possibility of war, lest their valuable cargoes of furs and trade goods that were moving through the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River be seized by the Americans. Many of the Montreal merchants had business contacts in New York, and on hearing of Madison's declaration, they sent dispatches to Canada. When Brock received the news at York, he in turn sent messages immediately to the western posts. And the two western posts, of course, were Detroit and Michilimackinac. Now then, let me see quickly, I also want to go to the end. Roberts must have realized that he had no time to lose. He knew Fort Michilimackinac well, because once it had been a British fort. Knew that it was stronger than his fort. Knew that Lieutenant Porter Hanks of the U.S. Artillery had a larger force of 60 regulars to his 39 men. After all, had they not watched out for each other's deserters through the years and escorted them back to the right garrison where they belonged? Had they not supplied each other with provisions in time of need? Why, 5 years ago, they had loaned the American fort 20 barrels of pork when it was in short supply. Captain Roberts realized that if he acted at once, he might capture the fort before the Americans knew that war had been declared. The First Nations, the fur traders, French Canadians, and Northwest Company employees responded to his appeal for support for his small force. As a result, he led 600 men who sailed in the Northwest Company's schooner Caledonia and a flotilla of canoes under the cover of darkness on July 17th. He landed at 3 a.m. on Mackinac Island. They had brought 2 British cannon with them. And when they landed, local farmer Michael Dousman gave them a yoke of oxen to pull the artillery to a hill overlooking the fort. Lieutenant Porter Hanks did not know that war had been declared, and he had no alternative but to surrender. Thus, the web of human relations that had been forming for years, military, fur traders, First Nations, farmers, and Métis, had, without loss of life or drop of blood, seemingly managed to create a miracle.
Terrific.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure to be with you. I hope you look at the books before you go down to the real refreshments. It's been great to be with you one more time.